International news now.
All right, we're going to start with the war in Ukraine. As spring approaches and the weather gets warmer, most observers expect Russia to launch another military offensive against a weakened Ukrainian military that has now found itself facing severe disadvantages against the larger and better equipped Russian military. Much of the media coverage in the United States has focused on the shortage of weapons that the Ukrainian military faces, largely to the delay in military aid from the United States. That's definitely a problem, which we'll discuss in a moment. However, there are additional forces that have contributed to Russia gaining an upper hand in the conflict. One of the biggest problems facing Ukraine's military effort is a shortage of soldiers. There are roughly 1 million men who currently serve in Ukraine's army. This is an enormous burden for a country with a population of only 38 million. The current military recruits are exhausted. Many of them have been on combat duty for 2 years. The United States has estimates that over 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and more than 120,000 have been wounded.
Now, the Russian military, which I wouldn't believe for a second, but their estimate is that 440,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this war. I would say that that's an exaggeration, but it's probably somewhere in between these two numbers. It's probably, 250,000 or more killed or wounded on the Ukraine side, and that's just military personnel, not civilians. So it's been a huge loss.
So President Zelensky recently announced a lowering of the conscription age from 27 to 25, which is politically unpopular for obvious reasons. The problem facing Ukraine is not simply a result of a relatively small country having to raise a large army to fight a much bigger foe. Ukraine is facing a demographic crisis that resulted in a much smaller number of young men of military age than in prior eras. As the graph on the slide shows, the number of Ukrainian men aged 18 to 30 is much smaller than the younger cohort and the older cohorts of young Ukrainian men. There are historical forces underlying this broader shortage of soldiers. Part of the reason for smaller numbers of young men dates back to the effects of World Wars I and II in Ukraine. Fewer babies were born during each conflict, leading to smaller generations of adults. These smaller generations in turn had fewer babies, leading to smaller generations many years later. A more recent cause for the current shortage of fighting-age men in Ukraine is the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the 1990s, there was an economic crisis in Ukraine that wiped out savings due to hyperinflation and created much greater uncertainty about the future. This uncertainty led many young people to decide not to have children. The birth rate dropped from an average of 1.9 children in 1991 to 1.1 children in 2001.
That's a huge.
That's essentially a demographic collapse,
yeah.
Right? That much smaller generation of boys born during the Soviet Union's collapse are now 18 to 27 years old, which is a prime age cohort for military service. Finally, Ukraine's demographic problems do not end there. The current war is also undermining birth rates. The number of births in Ukraine has dropped by nearly half from 2021 to 2023. This is due to two key factors. First, young men have joined the war effort instead of starting a family. And second, young Ukrainian women have fled Ukraine, moving to EU countries to avoid the fighting. One demographer described Ukraine's situation as follows. Future births in Ukraine depend on two factors: how many Ukrainian men die at the front and how many Ukrainian women return home from Europe.
Yeah, this is a big problem. And, one of the problems with this is that the decision to lower the conscription age, and you might have noticed that the conscription age in Ukraine is really high, right? I mean, they probably have room to go further down, right? I mean, in the United States, the conscription age is 18 years old. But there's a risk that the war effort is going to harm for a long, like an extended period of time and kind of permanently a whole generation in Ukraine, and that's going to have future problems and for Ukraine in terms of the availability of workers and in the rebuilding effort and the like. And so they've got to be kind of careful how they manage this. But the lawmakers who've been pushing Zelensky sort of held off on this change in the conscription age to see if they could avoid it, was that they just don't have a choice. They're in a war. They need soldiers. Not doing anything could have permanent problems as well in terms of defeat in the war. All right, so let's now move on to the issue of American military aid to Ukraine and where that stands. And before getting into the domestic battle within the United States over Ukrainian aid, let's briefly summarize how the delay in military aid is affecting the war in Ukraine. And so there was testimony just yesterday, actually, in the House Armed Services Committee, and the top U.S. general overseeing military operations in Europe, and he's also then the head of the NATO command. He warned members of Congress that Ukraine is falling significantly behind Russia in crucial armaments. And he said currently Russia holds a 5-to-1 advantage on artillery shells, right? And so they have a lot more ammunition. So they can fire 5 artillery shells at Ukraine to every 1 that Ukraine can fire back, right? And so that's a problem already. But the real warning was that ratio goes to 10-to-1, according to U.S. estimates, in a matter of weeks, because Ukraine's stockpile is just going down to close to zero, because that military aid that was slated to be passed actually last year has been held up for virtually 6 months. And so if it's not approved, this is a real problem. Other analysts have claimed that if the aid doesn't go through shortly, Ukraine could face really 2 scenarios, both of them negative. The best case scenario would be that Ukraine would just face massive casualties because of the shortage of artillery and other armaments. That's the best case scenario, which is terrible, right? But the worst case scenario would that there'd be a collapse of the Ukrainian front lines and a real territorial loss and potentially even defeat in the conflict. And so, just to be clear, what's happening here? Ukraine has been fighting arguably quite valiantly against a much larger Russian military, and for 2 years has managed to achieve a stalemate. After initial losses right at the beginning of the war, they pushed back the Russian military, and then since then there's been sort of no movement by either side. Neither side could capture significant new territory. They achieved this relative success, given the disparities in size and military strength, with the help of crucial military aid from the U.S. Now the U.S. military aid has been held up for roughly 6 months, and Ukraine is running out of arms, particularly artillery shells and air defense equipment, and this could reverse all of these successes. If the aid's continually to be delayed, Russia could win this war when it probably would not have if Ukraine received the aid. That's the analysis that people are giving here. So let's talk about the status of aid for Ukraine. Now, as you might remember, the Biden administration has been trying to win congressional approval for military aid for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. There's a package of $95 billion for all three. About $60 billion goes to Ukraine, but it hasn't been able to overcome opposition from very conservative Republicans in the House of Representatives. And so we're going to start this section with a clip from Sunday's talk show's Face the Nation interview with a Republican House member who explains the situation within the Republican caucus in the House. So let's roll that clip now.
Do you have any commitment from Speaker Johnson as to a date, a timeline for moving aid that I know you support?
Margaret, I believe that Speaker Johnson will bring up support for the supplemental appropriations for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, immediately after completing the work on FISA and FISA's extension. That deadline of April 19th makes it a priority for the first few days that we're back. But Ukraine remains a priority, as does our support for Israel and Taiwan. And yes, I believe he's fully committed to bringing it up to the floor immediately thereafter. And I think that's critical, as it should have been passed months ago.
But you want to, as I understand it, make some changes, including attaching a provision that would allow for the U.S. to seize Russian sovereign assets and use them in the future to rebuild Ukraine. Any tweaks you make, doesn't that slow down the pathway for this to actually pass through the Senate and get to the Ukrainians who say they are running out of time?
Well, the Repo Act that you're referencing, where we use Russian sovereign assets that are held in Western European or U.S. financial institutions, some $300 billion, would go a long way to filling the Ukrainian budget gap and be a good down payment for reconstruction to make Putin pay the ultimate cost of his illegal invasion of Ukraine. It had a strong vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 20-2, a strong vote in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, 40-2. These are good votes, and I think this provision would strengthen the package in the floor. I believe it has support in both the House and Senate, and it would be, in my judgment, a way to get more support for the total package for Ukraine, seizing these Russian assets. And there's support in Europe for this. Prime Minister Sunak is supportive of this strategy, and others in Europe.
There are some skeptics there as well, but I need to ask you, because your Republican colleague, Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you know, filed this motion to vacate that would oust Speaker Johnson. She said if he puts Ukraine aid to a vote and reauthorizes 702, the Republican base will go crazy. Do you agree? And is the Speaker at risk of being ousted if he does these things you say are essential?
Well, I don't share the view that Americans, including Republican voters, that believe that Putin should win in Ukraine. I think overwhelmingly Americans and Republican primary voters believe that Putin should be defeated in Ukraine. As I've said before, we should draw the line on authoritarian dictators, particularly permanent members of the Security Council, invading neighboring countries. And I believe both Democratic, Independent, and Republican voters support defeating Putin, backing Ukraine, and having a resolution here. It's not in America's economic, diplomatic, or military interest for Putin to be successful in Europe or in the Far East.
Okay, so just before we get into the current situation, let's review what has happened here and how we got here. Now, Republicans in the House of Representatives refused to pass a Ukraine aid bill at the beginning, way back in like August, September of 2023. And they said they weren't going to give any more military aid to Ukraine unless the Biden administration addressed problems with border security first. Remember that, right?
I remember.
Okay. Then the Biden administration worked with a bipartisan group in the Senate and produced a bill that combined Ukraine aid with a set of measures to address the border crisis by restricting asylum and doing a lot of other policy changes that were, by and large, conservative policies that the Democratic Party tended not to accept without some counterbalances, especially regarding accommodations for dreamers and the like. And so this was a really strong conservative piece of legislation. However, that bill failed in the Senate, even before getting back to the House, after Donald Trump publicly opposed the bill. Then after that, the Senate took out the border security stuff and just passed a bill that only provided military aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And that bill then passed overwhelmingly in the Senate with bipartisan support. In response, House Speaker Mike Johnson, facing pressure from his conservative lawmakers within the Republican caucus refused to bring that bill up to a vote at all in the House. And that's where things stood about 2 months ago. So 2 months have passed since that happened. They went on break for Easter for 2 weeks, all sorts of stuff. And so, however, Johnson now has signaled a change of heart. And he says he is looking for a way to bring this bill up for a vote in the House. However, Johnson and Republicans in the House say that they may want to add some conditions to make the bill more acceptable for their caucus, and that would slow down the process, as pointed out in the clip. Johnson has floated a few ideas, such as making some of the Ukraine aid a loan, which was a talking point for Donald Trump, about foreign aid in general, and also repurposing some $300 billion in seized Russian assets to fund Ukrainian aid. Now, so that's part of the obstacle, because if they do change it to get it passed in the House, then they'd have to send it back to the Senate. They'd have to reconcile the two bills. It would take a lot longer time, which we don't have a lot of time, as we've already pointed out. But there's also other threats. Many hard-right Republican members of the House are just completely and staunchly opposed to any additional aid for Ukraine. And Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia has already threatened to oust the speaker if he puts Ukraine aid up for a vote at all, right? Donald Trump has also weighed in on this, and Mike Johnson and Donald Trump are going to have a joint public appearance here this week, and he said that it would be stupid to give Ukraine aid at this point. So there's that. And finally, let me add, though, one twist to the politics swirling around this issue, and that is that aides to President Biden have been privately working behind the scenes to ensure that the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, can put the Ukraine aid package up to a vote and survive politically. And so there's been some back channeling here, and they've been in contact, these aides for the Biden administration, been in contact with Mike Johnson's office about Ukraine throughout the recess that Congress was just on. And Biden, for his part, has been holding off on criticizing Johnson when he raises things like, let's add some conditions and things like that. They're trying to give some breathing room so that the House Speaker can navigate a pretty tricky and vulnerable position that he's in, because he doesn't really want to lose his position over Ukraine. The Democrats probably don't want Mike Johnson to lose his position over Ukraine either, and so they're trying to fashion this. He could stay in power if the Democrats, if there was a move to oust him, the Democrats could save him, and that would be an interesting dynamic. It sort of is still all up in the air. But the first thing that has to happen is Johnson has to decide, is he going to take the risk and put the aid up for a vote? If it comes up for a vote, everybody's confident it's going to pass. And there's a lot of Republicans who will sign off on it and pass it. But there might be a cost to that, including the Speaker's position.
What's the lesson in all of this? There's always a deal.
There is always a deal.
There is always a deal, not just in politics, but often in life, too.
It's a life lesson, really.
The other thing, on just a little bit more specifics on how would the Democrats save him. So imagine there's a lot of resistance in the Republican caucus for throwing out the speaker because of the chaos that follows from McCarthy. And so we're looking at, if it was 8 to 10 Republicans that did it last time, we're looking at probably somewhere number slightly less than that, 4 or 5. And so how would the Democrats save them? 4, 5, 6 Democrats simply offset those votes.
Right.
And so it wouldn't be the
By
entire...
tradition, the opposing party never supports.
Yeah, never supports the speaker. And
right.
so what would basically happen is 4 or 5 with support, with a backroom deal with both Jeffries and Biden say, all right, we'll cast the ballot to save Johnson, because the Democrats have an interest in preserving his speakership right now, because they worry if he's out, then it's utter chaos until the next election.
Well, everything shuts down.
Yeah, everything shuts down.
And this is a lesson learned from the McCarthy ouster, right? I mean, there was talk that, McCarthy ultimately worked with Democrats to pass spending bills and things like that. And there was some talk that the Democrats could bail out McCarthy. They refused because they hated McCarthy, and he didn't give them a lot of room to negotiate on that. And so they didn't. They stuck together, didn't vote for McCarthy. He went down. But then the aftermath was the Republicans couldn't get a speaker for weeks and weeks and weeks, and no one runs that. And so there you go.
Okay, for our next update.
Oh, and then,
sorry.
all of this, again, I need to remind you because I care about this issue. Ukraine is literally losing a war it could win, arguably, or at least keep stalemated because of domestic politics in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be clear about the numbers. There are 15 hardliners in the Republican caucus that are threatening to throw Johnson out if he brings up a bill. So this is a procedural issue in the House. If he brings up a bill that, if it's voted on, it's clear will have bipartisan support and pass. Yeah. And so this isn't reflecting the will of the Republican caucus. This is 15,
right?
About 15 members that are threatening to oust him, and they're blocking it.
Yeah, so. And there's always members that are outliers in any coalition that will vote against their own party's policies. This happens regularly, but because the Republican majority has such a slim majority, they can't afford these defectors, and then they change the rules.
And one small update on this, the Republican majority in the last month has gotten even smaller to
one vote.
But why? Because Republican members of Congress are so frustrated with the radicals in the House, they resigned. And rather than waiting until the election, they said, we're out, we're done. Intentionally shrinking the majority to make it harder for their, basically giving their colleagues the finger and saying, we're done with this. So, okay.
Let's keep going.
For our next update, you disagree with that characterization?
No. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. So, okay, let's turn for our next update to the war in Gaza. In this update, we want to touch on two issues. The first is the state of fighting itself, and second, an emerging rupture in the relationship between the Biden administration and Netanyahu's government. We're going to start with a short clip from Sky News that offers an update on the fighting in Gaza, and let's roll that clip now.
Israeli forces have moved systematically through Gaza and are now as far south as the second city of Khan Yunis. Around 1.5 million Gazans have fled their homes in search of some safety, and they're now mostly living in rough conditions, crammed into a small area near the Egyptian border. Fighting has destroyed vast swathes of Gaza, as I saw for myself when I went into the center of Khan Yunis back in February.
We've just reached the center of Khan Yunis. It's just been captured, taken by the IDF. They think they've got control of it now, but there's a lot of gunfire still going on. And it was clearly, just look around, clearly a very, very heavy battle here.
Sporadic fighting continues in the north of Gaza as Hamas tries to regroup. And Israel has said that it will go into the southern city of Rafah, Hamas's last remaining stronghold, and currently the temporary refuge of around 1.3 million displaced civilians.
We will act in Rafah. It will take a few weeks. It will happen.
But the international community is warning against it, fearing a bloodbath unless the huge numbers of refugees can be moved elsewhere.
So the war in Gaza seems to have reached an important inflection point. On the one hand, the Israeli military has announced that it's withdrawing its forces from the city of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza in order to recuperate and prepare for future operations. According to Israeli defense officials, only one brigade will remain in southern Gaza. In addition, Israel has moved to allow more humanitarian aid to flow into southern Gaza, and ceasefire talks continue in Egypt, although no breakthrough seems forthcoming. The war has continued to produce high civilian casualties, with more than 33,000 total killed in Gaza, according to Gazan officials, and more than 13,000 Hamas fighters killed, according to Israeli officials. Some, including Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, has said that these actions have signaled a shift that suggests American pressure for Israel to change tactics is having an effect. On the other hand, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly declared that the date for the invasion of Rafah has been set, although he has not announced that date. The potential attack on Rafah and what form it may take is the next critical decision for Israel. The decision captures the dilemma that Israel has faced throughout its war in Gaza. On the one hand, Rafah is the last stronghold of Hamas. As such, capturing the city is essential to the Israeli government's stated goal of destroying Hamas and eliminating it as a military threat and a governing entity. Hamas leaders and thousands of its fighters are firmly established in Rafah. Arguably, if Israel does not invade Rafah, Hamas will survive. It would remain in control of the southern quarter of Gaza and could gradually rearm. Eventually, it could project its power northward to control most or all of Gaza from there and threaten Israel again. Additionally, if Hamas could claim even a partial victory, Israel's deterrent threats against other enemies in the region could be weakened as well. On the other hand, attacking Rafah also poses enormous risks. First and foremost, an assault on the city would inevitably cause many civilian casualties, despite assurances by Israel that it will move the civilians out of harm's way before launching the offensive. These civilian casualties could come on top of the already high death toll that the international community has found unacceptable. This would compound the already mounting international pressure on Israel and the United States, its main ally. Second, an attack on Rafah could expand conflict and turmoil in the region. For example, Egypt has warned Israel not to invade Rafah because of fears that it would result in Palestinians fleeing en masse into Egypt. That could produce both a new humanitarian crisis and a political challenge for Egypt, which has its own Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood, with ties to Hamas. Also, if Israel invades Rafah and threatens to defeat what remains of Hamas, this might initiate a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has thus far restrained its attacks to border skirmishes, but could decide to launch a full-scale war if Hamas faces extinction. Such a conflict could also expand to direct conflict between Israel and Iran, which supports both Hamas and Hezbollah. And finally, an attack on Rafah could result in domestic turmoil within Israel. The operation could require calling up a large number of Israeli reservists who were only recently released from service in Gaza. Moreover, the invasion would jeopardize any negotiations to free Israeli hostages, further fueling protests and opposition.
And these protests have already been pretty large and pretty angry, and so this would make that even worse. Okay, so the other main development we want to address here is the continuing rupture, or at least criticism from both sides in relations between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government over Israel's military strategy. And so we're going to start with a short clip from AP News that shows an important news conference from last week. And so let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
I'm not going to preview any potential policy decisions coming forward. What we want to see are some real changes on the Israeli side. If we don't see changes from their side, there'll have to be changes from our side. But I won't preview what that could look like. Now, they talked about I'm sorry?
Is that just the body count, or is there a specific change?
Again, in terms of concrete steps, what we are looking to see and hope to see here in coming hours and days is a dramatic increase in humanitarian assistance getting in, additional crossings opened up, and a reduction in the violence against civilians and certainly aid workers.
The president seems to have said to the prime minister today, make these concrete changes or else. It's the or else that I want to make clear here. Is the president threatening to withhold aid to Israel if they do not make these changes?
The president made it clear that our policies with respect to Gaza will be dependent upon our assessment of how well the Israelis make changes and implement changes to make the situation in Gaza better for the Palestinian people.
And how much time are you giving them to make these changes, to implement these concrete steps?
Again, we would hope to see some announcements of changes here in coming hours and days, and I'll leave it at that.
That's short.
Hours and days.
Okay, so the first thing to note is that from the beginning, the Biden administration has tried to balance support for Israel with other interests, such as preventing the war in Gaza from spreading and maintaining U.S. relations with Arab regional powers like Saudi Arabia. And this has meant that the Biden administration has tried to use its influence to push Israel to avoid high civilian casualties in Gaza. But the Netanyahu government has largely ignored most of these calls from the United States for restraint. And so now Biden has increased his criticism of Netanyahu, and there seems to be some signaling that the United States could somehow change its degree of support for Israel if things don't change. And so how has he been doing this? First, President Biden increased criticism of Israeli military strategy in an interview that got a lot of attention last week. And Biden said, quote, "I think he's doing a mistake." That is the way he said it. That's not a misprint. He's doing a mistake, and I don't agree with this approach. And then he went on further, and this is crucial. So he says, what I'm calling for is for Israelis to just call for a ceasefire. And this call for a ceasefire is a relatively new position for the Biden administration because for a long time, the United States used its influence, particularly in the United States, to block resolutions and other calls for a ceasefire. So, now part of this increased criticism was a reaction to an Israeli attack on a convoy of aid workers distributing humanitarian aid and assistance in Gaza. And Israel admitted that it launched an airstrike against the convoy, but said it was a mistake. Others, including the humanitarian organization that was hit by the airstrike, World Central Kitchen, doubted that claim, saying it had coordinated its presence and route in Gaza with Israeli authorities. And the Biden administration called the attack on the aid workers outrageous. So there's mounting criticism here. And in addition, in a call to Netanyahu, so President Biden and Netanyahu still are in communication, Biden threatened to condition future support for Israel. And that's what was talked about in the clip here. And it was a threat that the United States might withhold future support depending on how Israel addressed the Biden administration's concerns about civilian casualties and humanitarian lack of humanitarian aid in Gaza. And this is where some members of the Biden administration say that this tense phone call might have had an effect on the Israeli military allowing more aid to flow in Gaza. That was a recent announcement, and pulling back some of its forces out of Khan Yunus. Okay, so having said all that, as you could see from the clip, Jack Kirby's a little cagey, I would say, in his full-throated endorsement of all this talk about conditions. And there's clearly limits to this tougher line by the Biden administration. He voiced a lot of anger and frustration over Israel's conduct in Gaza, but President Biden has also emphasized that U.S. support for Israel remains strong. And this is particularly true in light of recent threats from Iran and Hezbollah over the last week. These threats were made more concrete from Iran because of an Israeli airstrike in Syria that killed 2 senior members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard and 5 more officers of that military outfit. And so Iran has promised to respond to this attack with an attack of its own against Israel, and the U.S. has been helping Israel prepare for this and sent its senior U.S. military commander to Israel because there's fears that Iran's soon going to launch a strike against Israel. And despite all of this frustration with the war in Israel, these sorts of threats maintain this close tie between the United States and Israel.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I read a story yesterday. So we're filming this on Friday morning. I think the expectation is that there would be an attack on Israel within the next couple of days.
Yeah,
the U.S. Embassy has warned U.S. citizens to keep movement, I think, restricted to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and not go outside. And I think, right, there was a debate in Iran. Do we strike Israel directly or its proxies, another or American interest in the region? And I think the debate is moving towards there's going to be some type of direct attack on Israeli territory.
And that's the real fear, right? And then you got a real fighting war between Israel and Iran.
Yeah. Well, and the question is, right, what's the scope of escalation from that point? And it's will depend in part on the nature of the Iranian attacks.
Right.
All right, so for our third update, we want to revisit the debate over border security, concentrating on the controversy over a law passed in Texas called SB 4. Just to review, Texas SB 4 makes illegally crossing the border a Class B misdemeanor in Texas. It carries a punishment of up to 6 months in jail. Repeat offenders could face a second-degree felony with a punishment of 2 to 20 years in prison. This law also requires state judges to order migrants returned to Mexico. If they are convicted, a judge could drop the charges if a migrant agrees to return to Mexico voluntarily. We're going to start with a clip from CBS News that discusses the latest hearing in an appeals court. So let's roll that clip now.
A federal court is weighing whether a controversial Texas immigration law is constitutional.
That's right. An appeals court heard arguments today from the Justice Department, ACLU, and the state of Texas. At issue is the law known as SB 4, which empowers local law enforcement to arrest and deport undocumented migrants suspected of illegally crossing the border.
CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoyo-Gavez is in our Washington bureau for us. So, Camilo, what was said during today's hearings? Bring us up to speed.
Hi, Lana. Texas and the Biden administration were back in federal court in New Orleans today to make their respective arguments for and against SB 4. This is the far-reaching Texas law that would essentially criminalize unauthorized immigration at the state level, empowering officials in the Lone Star State to make felony or misdemeanor arrests of migrants who are suspected of crossing into the U.S. from Mexico illegally or re-entering the country illegally for a second or third or fourth attempt. And it is important to note that one of the takeaways from this hearing is that there is still a lot of confusion and uncertainty as to how Texas officials will be implementing this law. One of the provisions in this measure allows state judges to issue de facto deportation orders against migrants who are suspected of violating this law. But the state acknowledged today in the hearing that it cannot physically remove people from the country without the consent of federal officials and also foreign governments like Mexico. And the Department of Justice and Mexico have both said that they will not help Texas enforce SB 4 and allow the state to return people to a foreign country like Mexico. And so there are still a lot of open questions.
A lot of open questions.
And some logistical challenges. All right, let's talk through this. SB 4 is currently on hold while on appeal in federal court. Remember that the Supreme Court ruled that SB 4 could go into effect while its constitutionality was being litigated in lower courts. However, an appeals court quickly reinstated the pause on the law. The issue was back in appeals court in early April. There have been a few interesting developments. During these arguments, lawyers for Texas admitted that Texas authorities cannot physically remove people from the country, which would severely hamper the enforcement of the law. So they can't enforce the law that they want to create. Instead, some Texas authorities have said that they might need to hand the detainees over to the federal government for removal. But the Department of Homeland Security has said its agents need approval from federal immigration authorities to deport migrants. This seems to allow the federal government to block enforcement of deportations ordered by Texas under SB 4. An additional hurdle to enforcement could be the Mexican government. The Mexican foreign minister stated that Mexico would not accept any return of Mexicans or non-Mexicans from local, state, or county authorities in Texas. Also declared that the Mexican government would put increased vigilance and controls at border crossings to prevent such removals if the law goes into effect. This raises the possibility of standoffs between Mexican and Texas state or local agents over attempted deportations. Again, who's running foreign policy here, right?
Yeah.
Mexico is saying we're only going to interact with the federal government of the United States.
Mexico came out because they also filed an amicus brief on this SB4, and they said one of the reasons you should not let this go into effect is because every state is going to choose its own immigration policy, and we don't want to deal with that. We just want to deal with the United States government.
Yeah.
So.
One final complication. One of the warnings from the Biden administration appears to be emerging already. The prospect that other states would follow the lead of Texas and take immigration enforcement into their own hands. Well, anyway, the Mexican government is saying, we're not going to deal with this. The Louisiana Senate has passed a similar law that allows state officials to arrest individuals suspected of entering U.S. illegally. The law now goes to the Louisiana House of Representatives.
And Iowa already passed the law?
No, I think I didn't read the article completely. I think the governor has proposed or want this. I'll have to look it up afterwards.
Do your homework, man.
Sorry.
Anyway.
Yeah.
All right.
It's chaos.
It's chaos. It is. It's chaos. Okay. One final set of things to talk about. And that is that all of these issues that we've been talking about this semester, and we updated you today, show how there's an interaction between domestic politics and international politics. International politics can come in and influence domestic politics, and vice versa. Domestic politics, as we've seen on Ukraine aid and on the war in Gaza, influences international politics. And so let's just outline it one more time in a few of these cases, right? In the Ukraine case, the fact that the last election in 2022 produced such a slim Republican majority in the House has derailed aid for Ukraine. There's a majority, a bipartisan majority in favor of passing aid to Ukraine. But because of the dynamics and the math in the House of Representatives, there's a small set of lawmakers in the House that can block that aid and prevent it from coming up to a vote, and that's exactly what they've done. And that has changed U.S. foreign policy on a crucial conflict that has arguably a legacy that could last for decades.
Yeah, and let's then think of, there's short and medium term elements of this, which is what we're seeing get played out in Congress. There's a long term elements of this, which is a more fundamental change within the Republican Party in terms of their foreign policy orientation. Isolationism versus internationalism. And what we're seeing, this is a manifestation of this deeper long-term split in the Republican Party. I was listening to a podcast on the way into the office this morning, this is what Steve Bannon, who is credited for being one of the key intellectual and marketing forces behind the MAGA movement, and he views Trump as a vessel. This is one of his larger long-term goals, which is reorienting the foreign policy views of the Republican Party in a more nationalist, anti-globalist, anti-multilateralism fashion. And so, in a sense, his political program is he wants to reorient the Republican Party on its foreign policy views, and so there's this deeper long-term, in part because he thinks that's a winning strategy for the Republicans to secure long-term permanent majorities electorally in the United States. And so we're going to use foreign policy as a wedge issue, challenge the globalists, challenge the internationalists, create a nationalist coalition. So we're seeing this play out over Ukraine, but just want to point out there's larger domestic political goals associated with this long-term shift within the Republican Party.
Right, and what's happening in the Republican Party is that there's leftover neoconservatives and Reagan Republicans that don't have that orientation. Yeah. And they're a lot of them are in the Senate, but there's, a significant number. I mean, John Cornyn is not.
Mitch McConnell,
yeah. These people aren't on board with that, but they can't control the legislation right now.
Well, and what's significant here, if you look at resignations, particularly in the House, officials that have decided, well, we're not going to serve anymore, they're predominantly from the old neocon position, internationalist
the establishment,
position. The establishment, yes. The rhinos.
Yes. And so that's an example. Now here, let's look at the war in Gaza, right? I mean, there's been a domestic effect, and it could play out in the election. Like, we don't know, right? But so far, the Biden administration clearly is more critical of Netanyahu and its government, in part because it's getting a lot of pressure from within the Democratic Party about its support for Israel. That used to be a pretty easy sell within both parties, and Democrat and Republican. But now there's a part of the Democratic Party that wants to revisit that. And because the Biden administration has had such strong support of Israel, that part of the Democratic Party has been voicing its opposition to that in these primary contests, trying to demonstrate that there is a significant part of Biden's coalition that won't vote for Biden unless he changes tack on his support for Israel. Now, it's unclear how this plays out, but clearly the Biden administration wants some sort of ceasefire or some sort of change so that he doesn't face an Israel that is so unpopular and so toxic for parts of his coalition in November.
Yeah,
right?
And I would say two electoral consequences to think about here. One is Michigan.
Yeah.
And whether his full-throated support of Israel costs him Democratic votes in Michigan. And the second is y'all's coalition voters 18 to 30.
Right. Exactly.
And the concern is that you all just stay home.
Yeah, you won't vote, I mean, part of the question is, well, are they seriously going to vote for Trump? And why would they, there's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of sympathy on the Republican side for the Palestinian cause. And so you'd think that they might tack back to the Biden administration given those choices. But there's a risk that they just won't vote, right?
And this is what Democrats are concerned about because they're confident that Republicans are going to vote. They're going to have less of a turnout issue than Democrats are.
And the math here, just like in the Republican House, right, is consequential. If it weren't such a close race in a few battleground states that have, over the last two election cycles, been won by literally thousands or a few tens of thousands votes, this wouldn't be as big a concern. But Michigan's a huge concern because Biden won Michigan, which was crucial to his electoral victory in 2020, by the slimmest of margins. And so just a few voters not showing up would cost him that state, which could then cost him the election.
Yep.
So the border crisis is the same sort of thing. That international issue, right, catapulted into the consciousness and became this electoral issue in part because the border crisis hit big cities that were ruled by Democratic mayors earlier this year. And because of that, the Democratic Party shifted its stance on immigration and then tried to, address the border crisis because it became the biggest issue in the election, at least for now, right? But then, domestic politics also weighed in when they tried to do that and tried to construct a policy that gave some concessions to the conservative side of that debate. It got derailed for domestic policy reasons by the Republicans who were asking for it in the first place because of presidential politics.
Yeah, and so just one thing I would add on this that's, I think, interesting in the immigration debate is we've seen another layer of this. So traditionally we talk about international politics that then that then manifest as a partisan conflict between Democrats and Republicans that we see play out in Congress or in a battle between Congress and the president. there's another layer to the immigration one, which is it's also challenging and playing out through the institutions of federalism.
Right.
Right, in the state versus the federal government. This is another manifestation of this deeper conflict, but it's occurring in different institutional terms, and we've talked about before, but then raises larger questions about can the federal government manage and coordinate foreign policies? Or are you going to have a series of blocking maneuvers by states that undermine its ability to create a coherent policy? And then again, how do foreign governments respond? That's what makes the Mexican government's response so interesting to this, because what's the Mexican government trying to do? They're trying to reinforce the federal government's authority by telling the states, you guys can make all the laws that you want, but we're not going to deal with you.
Right.
But I mean, that's interesting in itself, because then it suggests that the federal domination could be reinforced by external actors,
Right.
not a product of some new internal deal.
And ultimately, the Supreme Court will decide this.
Yeah.
Probably.
Right.
And then that all of it, ultimately domestic politics is going to have the final say on international politics and U.S. foreign policy with the results of the 2024 election.
Yeah,
and the differences are stark. If you go down the line on these huge issues, what the United States policy is on Ukraine is black and white different under a Biden administration versus a Trump administration.
Yes. And the long-term maintenance of U.S.
European,
this network of alliances, the post-1945 order, this is all essentially up for a vote in 2024. And it's not, don't just take our words for it. Watch how other governments around the world are responding to this. The rest of the world is responding to this in the same way. They are expecting, if Trump is elected, to see a massive sea change in U.S. foreign policy that, again, revises much of the larger global order that has served to regulate how states interact with each other over the last 80 years. So that's all we can say at this. So pay attention
vote.
to the election. So vote. This is a big one.
Whichever way this is a big one.
Yeah, and I think, I go back and forth on this. Everyone wants to say this is the most important election of our. This time, I think it's actually true. I think this is the most. I think this is the most important election of my lifetime. I'll leave it at that. So anyway, have a good rest of the semester. If you have questions about studying for exams, please reach out to us. Otherwise,
there's one more exam to go.
There's one more exam to go. Otherwise, have a good rest of the term.